first. Excellent. I was in a meeting I was supposed to record, and I had paused the recording, and then I had not started the recording back up, so the meeting did not get.
That's a Zoom classic.
Oh.
And it was
I'm
lovely
sorry.
because the person who was co-hosting with me, he was like, "Oh, that's my fault." I was like, "It is not your fault. You were not clicking around and doing things. That was me." Anyway.
Wow. Well, we're good now. I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and turn my video off while we're waiting for people. And then when Kate gives me the okay, I'll start my intro.
I'll do the same then.
All right, I'm gonna start. I'll start the webinar right now.
All. I'll see you soon.
Let's get started. Welcome. As you all come in, just go ahead and you should be able to access the chat and just say hi and tell us where you're joining from. And we're going to get started here in just a few minutes. Hey from Dallas. I bet it's much warmer in Dallas than it is where I am. Kansas City, London. Hello. It's nighttime where you are by now. Stacy will be very happy to hear that you are originally from Southern Illinois. Hi from Wales, very cold here. Brr. Apologies if you hear my dog bark in the background. Oops, sorry, here we go. As we come in, just saying hi. We are very much looking forward to this talk. We'll start here in just a minute. Welcome in. I see some of our board members are on. Excellent. ARCE-MO is representing well. Love it. All right. Mhm. All right. Give about another minute and then we will get started. All right, I'm shutting off the chat. And okay. All right, Stacy, I think we can go ahead and get started.
All right, thank you so much. Welcome ARCE-MO members and guests. My name is Stacy Davidson and I'm the president of ARCE Missouri. It's my pleasure to welcome you today for the last event in ARCE-MO's 2022 programming lineup. It is ARCE Missouri's mission to celebrate and share the cultures and histories of Egypt from the ancient through Islamic periods with Missouri and its neighboring communities. We are pleased that our virtual events are able to expand our programming beyond those geographic areas, and we welcome our national and international attendees to this event. You can stay up to date with ARCE Missouri news and events by following us on Facebook, Twitter, or by accessing our website. Although both ARCE National and ARCE Missouri provide free public outreach events like this one, some lectures, workshops, and benefits are restricted to ARCE members. If you enjoy ARCE Missouri programming and would like to be more involved in our organization, visit the Join ARCE section of our website. And we would also encourage you, if you are so inclined, to become an ARCE member to affiliate with our specific chapter, which is ARCE Missouri, and it's listed under Kansas City, Missouri. We have a very special presentation for you today. I am happy to introduce Dr. Ines Torres, Ms. Luisa Silva, and Mr. Guy Borges Pires, who will present On the Outskirts, the Pasts and Futures of Brazilian and Portuguese Egyptology. We will have time for question and answer at the end of the presentation. Please type your questions in the Q&A box that should be at the bottom of your screen. I would like to thank ARCE Missouri board member, Dr. Kate Shepard, for hosting this event and Missouri S&T for their webinar sponsorship. Without further ado, let's extend a warm ARCE Missouri welcome to our presenters.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Stacy, and thank you to ARCE Missouri for giving us the platform to share a bit about our work and about Egyptology in our countries, Portugal and Brazil. My name is Ines Torres, and together with my colleagues Luisa Zardia Silva and Guilherme Borges Pires, we will be presenting our project, Luso-Brazilian Egyptology's contribution to a global discussion whose main goal is to demonstrate the importance of academic production in Portuguese-speaking contexts and by Portuguese-speaking scholars, thus reclaiming our seat at the table in a global Egyptological context. Our colleague René Lemos, who is the fourth and founding member of our project, was unfortunately unable to be here today. So before we go into the project itself, we'll first introduce some of the issues that led us to start this project. And afterwards, Guilherme will give an overview of the development of the Egyptological studies in Portugal, followed by Luisa, who will give a similar overview for Brazil. And then I will dive deeper into the project before bringing our talk to a close. So it is important to highlight that we're not the first to reflect on the role of Lusophone Egyptology in both local and global contexts, or as we like to call them, Lusophone Egyptologies, plural, to highlight the diversity of views, approaches, methodologies, and so forth. We've compiled here a short overview of publications in which the development and current issues of Brazilian and Portuguese Egyptologies have already been discussed. And as you can see from the titles on this slide, Lusophone Egyptological scholarship is not only produced in Portuguese, but in several other languages, including English. Someone whose mother tongue is Portuguese and who studies and or publishes outside of the Portuguese-speaking space is still a Lusophone scholar, which is something we feel the need to highlight. So while we are aware of what has already been published on this topic, we aim to take the issue farther afield with our project, which intends to reflect on Lusophone Egyptological practices and their contribution to global Egyptology as a whole, thus broadening approaches, perspectives, theories, methodologies, and so forth. Egyptologies produced in Portuguese tend to be excluded from the dominant mainstream Egyptological discourse, a fact which can be clearly visible in recent works alluding to the history of Egyptology. See, for instance, one of the most recent publications on world history of Egyptology, edited in 2020 by a group of authors from the global north. Each chapter of this edited volume is dedicated to Egyptology within a country or a group of countries. The lack of discussions of Egyptology in Portugal, Brazil, and other countries from the global south is absolutely striking, almost as if they did not exist or did not contribute to the production of Egyptological knowledge at a global level. In the case of Brazil, there was a passing mention by the editors in the introduction, but since no chapter was dedicated to Brazil, it seems that it was just deemed unnecessary. This demonstrates that there is knowledge of Brazilian Egyptological scholarship, but that this might not be considered relevant in a global context. Portugal is also mentioned in passing in several of the chapters, but it did not deserve a chapter of its own. On the other hand, the editors saw fit to include a chapter on ancient Egypt in the cinema, which is puzzling at best. Nevertheless, there are currently 2 edited volumes with chapters dedicated to Brazilian Egyptology, which you can see on this slide. These chapters, however, did not give a comprehensive view of all the theories and methodologies used in Brazilian Egyptology, which often differ from dominant traditions in Egyptology. For instance, social theory, mainly Marxist, and the hypothetical deductive method, which have been used in studies about ancient Egypt in Brazil since the 1980s, have only recently been incorporated in mainstream Egyptological studies, with some exceptions, naturally. Egyptological studies have traditionally neglected theoretical thought developed in and incorporated by other fields, such as archaeology and anthropology, sometimes even denying the use of theory as a whole, focusing more on the publication of data than on its interpretation. This is dramatically different from what happens in Portugal and Brazil, where generally speaking, the interpretation of ancient Egyptian sources is at the foreground and the publication of new data is at the background, mostly due to the lack of access to unpublished data from Egypt. The chapters in these 2 books give more visibility to Egyptology in Brazil in a global context, but unfortunately, there is no recent work written about Portuguese Egyptology for a global audience, by which I mean in English or another of the traditional Egyptological languages. There are several possible reasons for this discrepancy that can be discussed and debated, but which are mostly due to the specificities of each country and how Egyptology has developed and has been practiced in Portugal as opposed to Brazil. So why is Portuguese-speaking Egyptological production considered peripheral, by which I mean, why has it not achieved recognition within mainstream Egyptology? This is largely due to the fact that most academics outside the Lusophone context do not read Portuguese, and that Egyptology functions to this day as a pillar of support for academic coloniality. That is to say, Egyptology was born to appropriate and produce knowledge about Egypt, which was then used to legitimize Europe as the owner of the world and of its ancient history. So the center-periphery opposition, which can be considered to have originated in dependency theory and world systems theory, and which nowadays is often deconstructed on the basis of post-colonial theory, continues to be used to describe the reality of Egyptology and its scholarly production. Moreover, as already mentioned by Lange in on his edited volume, Global Egyptology, there are several socioeconomic inequalities that perpetuate this classificatory system of center-periphery and that make it extremely difficult for academics and institutions in the so-called periphery to have access to resources, such as libraries and archives, grants to finance projects and individual research, networking events with scholars from the center, and so forth. However, the existence of an ever-growing academic Egyptological production in Portuguese, and also by Portuguese speakers in other languages, such as English, cannot be ignored, nor can we ignore their contributions to the study of Northeast African sources, realities, and issues. Although relegated to a supposed periphery, this academic production is recurrently presented and discussed in large scientific meetings in Brazil and in Portugal, but also in spaces usually considered the center of knowledge production. Lusophone Egyptologies present innovative, interdisciplinary, and theoretical approaches shaped through multiple and diverse contributions, such as archaeological excavations, museum studies, language and grammar studies, and reception studies, among many others. This academic work, designed and conducted in Portuguese or in other languages by Portuguese-speaking scholars, often suggests different perspectives applied to the ancient Nile Valley. Such perspectives may include reinterpretations of a traditional Egyptological modus operandi, or even creative approaches and alternative ways of thinking and doing. As a result, other histories of the cultures of the Nile Valley emerge based on different approaches to material culture, textual documents, and images produced by the ancients. But in order to understand the contributions of Lusophone Egyptology to the field, it is necessary to contextualize their development and current state, both in Portugal and in Brazil. So I'll now introduce my colleague, Guilherme Borges, who will give us a diachronic overview of Egyptology in Portugal.
Thank you, Ines. As we just heard, even if Egyptology is a field of global engagement, different national and local approaches regarding Egyptologies have been adopted. Whereas a few of these national and local narratives are better known, others have remained largely absent from Egyptology's past and present debates, such as the Portuguese ones. In the next few minutes, I will briefly discuss Portuguese Egyptologists, intentionally using the plural, instead of trying an identitarian quest on the essence of the Portuguese Egyptologists, which would fall into reductionist viewpoints. This contribution presents a diachronic picture of the numerous pathways walked in Portugal vis-à-vis ancient Egypt, highlighting a few of its key events and the historical political factors that led to Portugal and Egypt's encounters. I would like to start this work of art by the Portuguese painter Vieira Lusitana. It was painted in 1770. It consists of one of the many rests on the flight into Egypt by Portuguese early modern artists. I decided to kick off this section of today's talk with this painting because, contrary to other works of this genre, it depicts pyramids, establishing an immediate visual association with Egypt, but it simultaneously portrays the two main sources that have long informed the interests and perceptions of Egypt in Portugal and in several other countries. On the one hand, the biblical world, represented by the Holy Family, and the classical one on the other, hinted by the slightly classical take on the obelisk. Starting in the 16th century, Portuguese colonialism in Africa and Asia adds a layer to conceptualizations of Egypt in Portugal, being deeply entwined with the genesis of Egyptology in the country, or at least the entrance in ancient Egypt. In fact, countless visitors travel via Egypt on their way to Portuguese colonized lands in Asia or upon returning to Portuguese European territory. One such explorer was António Tenreiro, a member of the military in the Portuguese state of India. He became known for his travels through Western Asia from Hormuz to Portugal, of which he gave an account in his Itinerário or Itinerary, published in 1560. On his journey back to Portugal by land, he passed through different cities, including Cairo, to which the Turks deported him on charges of being an agent of the Persian Shah. After being freed, he traveled down the Nile River and reached Alexandria, intending to return to Portugal by the Mediterranean routes. While in Egypt, Tenreiro saw mummies and the pyramids, and he narrates his experiences and impressions of Egypt. Another such detailed itinerário is the one written by the Franciscan friar Gaspar de São Bernardino. He left for India in 1601, returning to Portugal 5 years later publishing his traveling account in 1609. The voyage begins in Goa. After a shipwreck in the middle of the Indian Ocean, he passes through Persia, Iraq, and Syria. What is particularly striking in his account is that despite not passing by Egypt, Gaspar de São Bernardino still feels the need to invoke pharaohs and pyramids when referring to the biblical book of the Exodus. A completely different traveling account to Egypt is the one provided by Essa de Queiroz, a renowned Portuguese diplomat and writer whom the Khedive Ismail invited for the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. His impressions have only survived fragmentarily in an ensemble of Queirosian documents. He visited Giza, Saqqara, and Heliopolis, making references to several ancient and pharaonic sites. He also went to the Bulak Museum, which had been founded 6 years before by Auguste Mariette. Queiroz' account detaches from biblical topics, focusing on describing the country's natural features and man-built constructions. For Queiroz, Egypt was a land of progress, of which Portugal should be more cognizant. 8 years prior to Essa de Queiroz travel to Egypt, in 1861, the Curso Superior de Letras, literally Superior Course of Letters, was inaugurated in Lisbon at the convent of Nossa Senhora de Jesus, currently the Sciences Academy of Lisbon. It was the first establishment in Portugal devoted explicitly to higher education in history, philosophy, and literary studies. After a public tender held in 1863, Jaime Muniz, a Portuguese politician and intellectual, became professor of the course entitled Philosophical Universal History, taught in 1865 and 66, which included basic notions on science and the state of the art on ancient Egypt. 2 years later, in 1868, Antonio Enes presented a dissertation entitled The Religious Philosophy of Egypt in the same institution. This was the first Portuguese academic work primarily devoted to ancient Egypt, a significant achievement, given that the first embryo of ancient Egyptian institutionalization in an academic context had occurred very recently. However, this first attempt at teaching ancient Egypt in Portugal faced criticism, namely at the Casino Conferences, a series of public lectures held in the Casino in Lisbon in the spring of 1871. These conferences gathered writers and intellectuals who criticized Portugal's inability and unwillingness to join international and European intellectual debates. They sought to propel change in Portuguese society and politics through philosophical and scientific debates. In a session dedicated to education, Francisco Adolfo Coelho, a Portuguese intellectual, complained about a certain professor, plausibly Jaime Muniz, who lectured on ancient Egypt at the Curso Superior de Letras without having ever visited Egypt or learned Egyptian hieroglyphs. For Adolfo Coelho, studying ancient Egypt was paramount for the country's progress. Nevertheless, if Portugal wanted to keep up with the other European nations, its education system needed to disengage from its traditional religious Christian matrix, investing in secular and well-trained professors. The study of ancient Egypt is here envisaged within the broader context of the Portuguese education system in the aftermath of the establishment of the liberal regime. But apart from this initial investment in teaching, the second half of the 19th century also marked a particularly important moment in the diplomatic relations between Portugal and Egypt, to which the use of antiquities as a political bargaining chip was not unrelated. Following the discovery of the collective tomb of the priest of Amun of the 21st dynasty, known as Bab al-Gassus, in 1891, and the subsequent logistical problems caused by such an immense set of mummified bodies and coffins, the Egyptian authorities decided to offer part of this collection to countries represented at the coronation of the Khedive Abbas II, which included Portugal. In 1893, a set of about 88 chaptis and 5 anthropomorphic coffins arrived at the Society of Geography in Lisbon, where they are still kept today. Such an ensemble was the largest Egyptian collection at that moment in Portugal. In the same year, another Portuguese archaeological landmark occurred. By decree of December the 20th, the Museu Etnográfico Português, Portuguese Ethnographic Museum, was formed, and José Leite Vasconcelos, a Portuguese philologist, archaeologist, and ethnographer, was appointed its first director. The museum was designed to represent, quoting, the material part of the life of the Portuguese people, end of quote. The museum was then divided into two parts, the archaeological and the modern one. In 1900, its final move to the Jerónimos Monastery in Belém, Lisbon, was resolved, remaining the now called Museu Nacional de Arqueologia, National Museum of Archaeology, headquarters until today. The museum began holding non-Portuguese artifacts despite its original name and intentions early in its history, and this was mainly due to Leite de Vasconcelos' international career. Between 1899 and 1901, He studied archaeology, epigraphy, philology, and history in Paris, and built his European academic network. A letter to the German classical scholar Emil Hubner, dating from 1899, shows that he recommended late Vasconcelos to visit Bonn and see Georg Loschka. Late Vasconcelos did so and returned to Portugal with 2 Egyptian palettes from Bonn's Museum of Art. Egypt will be crucial for late Vasconcelos' scientific path. In fact, to the best of my knowledge, he only traveled twice outside the European continent, in both cases to Egypt, to participate in the first and second sessions of the Cairo Archaeological Congress. The first session of the Congress, organized and chaired by Gaston Maspero, was held in 1905. The second one was scheduled for April 1909. As the Lisbon Academy of Science representative, José Leite Vasconcelos chaired the prehistoric archaeological section, where he presented the paper Présentation d'une palette égyptienne ovoide, presumably focusing on one of the palettes offered by Loschka 10 years before, and this contribution was published in the proceedings of the Congress. Late Vasconcelos brought about 70 objects from Cairo, Alexandria, and Luxor from this second trip to Egypt. These acquisitions and offerings were deposited in the Egyptian room on display at the National Archaeological Museum until present day. Besides their intrinsic archaeological and historical value, late Vasconcelos was particularly struck by the similarities he identified between Egyptian and Portuguese prehistoric material. For him, acquiring Egyptian artifacts for the museum was a step towards researching Portuguese and Lusitanian heritage and history. Here, you can see a small selection of Egyptian artifacts brought from Egypt by late Vasconcelos, including a pre-dynastic cruciform palette and a Ptolemaic lucerne offered by Evaristo Breccia, then director of the Greco-Roman Museum in Alexandria. Other remarkable objects include papyri inscribed in Demotic, Coptic, and Arabic, an alabaster bracelet, and a fragment of a door jamb from Deir el-Medina. Vasconcelos' Egyptian input to the museum will later be enhanced by artifacts brought to Portugal as a result of the Royal Eastern Mediterranean Tour, performed by the last Portuguese consort queen, Amélia de Orleans, accompanied by the royal princes Luís Filipe and Manuel. From February to April 1903, the royal family visited a few Mediterranean ports and the journey ended in Cairo. Queen Amélia brought about 200 artifacts to Portugal, acquired in uncertain circumstances. Araújo stated that the Egyptian Khedive Abbas II may have offered the artifacts to the Portuguese royals, and in fact, on the photographic album Queen Amélia compiled upon returning to Portugal, there is a picture, which I show on the slide, portraying the royal princes together with the Khedive. However, a more vocal agency by the Queen in collecting objects should not be immediately discounted. Indeed, further research on the acquisition processes of Egyptian objects in Portugal is pressing, as little is clairvoyant. Regardless, flipping through the album's pages, it appears that Cairo and Egyptian archaeological sites were the ones that most captivated Princes Manuel, age 14 then, and Luís Filipe, age 16, who took most of the photos. Prince Manuel will then become Manuel II, Portugal's last king, after his father Carlos and brother Luís Filipe's assassination in 1908. 2 years later, in 1910, the Republic was established and the royal family's collections were inventoried and reverted to the Portuguese state. Queen Amélia's Egyptian artifacts were then added to the Archaeological Museum. During the Portuguese First Republic and within the context of World War I, an archaeological-related political and diplomatic incident occurred. Due to Portugal's initial neutrality, SS Cheruskia, a German cargo ship on its way back from Basra in modern-day Iraq, docks in Lisbon. The ship contained several crates of Assyrian artifacts originating from the archaeological works of Walter André, a German archaeologist. Under British pressure, Portugal seized 72 German ships in 1916. Germany declares war on Portugal while still fighting Britain. Crates with Assyrian artifacts are moved into a Lisbon customs warehouse and the fight continues. Throughout the war, the belligerents corresponded about the crates. The British wanted the crates temporarily transferred to London and then sent to the newly occupied Mesopotamian region. In 1921, Augusto Nobre, then Minister of Public Instruction, ordered the transfer of the Cherusca spoils to Porto. In the following year, the collection entered the Museum of Historical Archaeology. Finally, in 1926, 10 years after the incident had begun, Germany and Portugal reached a deal. Portugal agreed to return the Assyrian items to Germany, and in exchange, Germany sent back a curated collection of artifacts from around the world, donated by the Berlin Museum, which included over 100 Egyptian items currently on display at the National History and Science Museum of the University of Porto. The exchange of antiquities as a political weapon and the negotiation of objects from different antiquity, historical and geographical contexts may be highly informative of war and colonialism, as well as Western colonial and military powers' subjective value perception on different Asian cultures. War and international politics triggered another, so to say, new Egyptian collection in Lisbon, gathered by Carlos Sarkis-Gulbenkian, a British Armenian businessman who during the Second World War fled to Portugal, where he would die in 1955. He left a significant portion of his fortune in art collections to the Carlos Gulbenkian Foundation in Lisbon. Carlos Gulbenkian acquired his first Egyptian artifact in 1907. Over the years that followed, purchases of works for this collection became increasingly recurrent, having Howard Carter as an intermediary and advisor. Despite his interest in Egypt, Gulbenkian only visited the country in 1934, when he was 65, after he had collected the most significant objects from this collection, which are now on display at the Carlos Gulbenkian Museum in Lisbon. The photograph that the collector took during this trip, next to the statue of the falcon god Horus at the Edford Temple, inspired sculptor Leopoldo de Almeida to carve the statue in the foundation's gardens. In the 80s, the Carlos Gulbenkian Museum collection was the only one mentioned in Bynes and Malek's Atlas list. This remained unaltered in the 2000 revised edition, despite its small size compared to other collections in Portugal. Moreover, while not being Portuguese himself, Gulbenkian is the only individual somehow related to Portuguese Egyptology, including in Who Was Who in Egyptology. It is striking for me that the scarce mentions of Egyptology in Portugal in such reference books refer to a wealthy individual who kept strong business ties with economic powers such as England, France, and the USA, often considered part of the center of Egyptological activity. Meanwhile, these were the times of the Portuguese dictatorship, Western Europe's longest far-right regime, which lasted for 48 years. The right-wing Estado Novo dictatorship's ideological project aimed to create a multi-continental colonial Portuguese identity, leading to intellectual investment in Portuguese colonies at the time and a disregard for everything considered not Portuguese enough. Not having been colonized by the Portuguese, Western Asia and Northern Africa tend to be absent from Estado Novo's foreign policy. However, this vast region and its politics were always a variable in Oliveira Salazar's foreign policy and the concern of Portuguese public opinion in the post-World War II era. In a speech delivered in 1947, Salazar said Egypt and Abyssinia were exceptions on a continent dominated by 6 European powers. Later on, Salazar paid attention to political developments on the southern Mediterranean coast, highlighting the potential destabilizing power of Arab nationalism in the north, regarding what he referred to as the Black Africa in the south. Salazar's personal views on ancient Egypt are unknown. What seems clear is that the dictatorial government did not invest in Egyptological research. In 1968, Fernando de Almeida, the Archaeological Museum's third director, wrote in a letter that the Egyptian collection at the museum was, quoting, a rather heterogeneous set from the most diverse origins, whose classification and study await the efforts of a specialist in Egyptology, a field that among us has not yet been sufficiently cultivated, end of quote. A year later, the National Archaeological Museum received more Egyptian artifacts offered to Salazar by António Júdice Bustorff Silva, a close friend and one of the most enthusiastic Estado Novo supporters in the Portuguese National Assembly. Salazar will then give the museum these objects. It remains unclear whether this demonstrates Salazar's disregard for ancient Egypt or his strong belief that heritage belongs to state-owned and public institutions. The dictatorship ended with the Carnation Revolution, which overthrew Estado Novo on April 25, 1974, causing major social and political changes in Portugal, ending the Portuguese colonial war and leading to Portugal's transition to democracy. The revolution affected Portugal's university system and consequently the archaeology and Egyptology study in Portugal. 3 years after, in 1977, the first Portuguese chair of Oriental Antiquity was established at Nova University of Lisbon School of Social Sciences and Humanities, Nova FCSH for short. Founded that year, offering a course on pre-classical societies, cultures, and civilizations. 2 years later, the first Portuguese Oriental Institute was created at the same institution. The first Portuguese research unit specifically devoted to the field of Oriental studies, with a particular emphasis in Arab and Islamic studies. It promoted the creation of a specialist library, held conferences, published a book series, and provided courses on ancient and modern African and Asian languages, including Hebrew, Arabic, Egyptian hieroglyphic, and Akkadian. In 2014, the Oriental Institute was absorbed by SHAM, Center for the Humanities, with which Inês and I are currently affiliated. In 1886, José Nunes Carreira founded the Second Oriental Institute, this time at the School of Arts and Humanities of the University of Lisbon, FLUL for short. Currently, FLUL Asian History and Egyptology researchers are affiliated with the Center of History of the same institution. Besides FLUL and Nova FCSH, Egyptological research in Portugal is currently carried out at Universidade Aberta and Universidade Católica Portuguesa. António Augusto Tavares, a full professor at Nova FCSH, and José Nunes Carreira, a full lecturer, were instrumental in establishing pre-classical and Egyptological studies in post-revolutionary Portugal. Despite not being Egyptologists, they sought to integrate ancient Egypt and Egyptology into the pre-classical world. Their intellectual and academic contributions helped shape Asian history comparative studies, and in some ways denied the notion that Egypt was an isolated civilization. Their comparative efforts influenced future Egyptology research in Portugal, making it an originality of some kind. They also collaborated with international scholars, organized conferences and classes to advance Egyptology in Portugal and Portuguese academia. Moreover, they supervised the first, so to say, proper Egyptological PhD thesis submitted at Portuguese universities, namely the ones presented by Maria Helena Trindade Lopes and Luís Manuel de Araújo. The new millennium represented a significant moment for Portuguese Egyptologists. The ARCE Palace Memphis archaeological project, which ran from 2000 to 2010, directed by Maria Helena Trindade Lopes, was the first and, until present moment, the only Portuguese project in Egypt. The excavations in Tuman confirmed some of Petrie's and Kemp's hypotheses. Above all, the investigation helped clarifying the Saïs dynasty politics, while contributing to understand Apria's reign, the fourth of the 26th dynasty, as a turning point in Egypt's imperialist history and policies, with a new route favoring the Mediterranean. To finish this brief overview of Portuguese Egyptologists, I would like to show a small selection of a few, so to say, happenings that took place in the last 20 years. Portuguese Egyptologists of the 21st century include international conferences held in Lisbon, with the respective publication of the proceedings, studies on ancient Egyptian texts, interdisciplinary studies, and projects dealing with the reception of antiquity in Portugal. The increasing internationalization of Portuguese Egyptologists and their scientific, methodological, and theoretical contributions refute the notion that peripheral Egyptological countries have little impact on the field. On the other hand, while reclaiming a place at the table of the so-called central Egyptological powers, Portuguese Egyptologists greatly benefit from academic partnerships established within the Iberian American space, namely with Brazil. Two telling examples of such joint efforts are the first Portuguese grammar of ancient Egypt, written by a Brazilian scholar but published in Portugal, and, dare I say, our own project as well. And speaking of Brazil, Luisa will now address Brazilian Egyptologists' past and futures.
Thanks, Guy. And to shift to Brazil, I wanted to start a bit differently than Guilherme did for Portugal, because I think if any of you have heard of Brazilian Egyptology before, at least some of you have probably also heard of the 2018 fire in the National Museum of Brazil, a building which was historical in itself since it served as the residence for the imperial family. In fact, I think if any of you have heard of Brazilian Egyptology, I bet it was in many cases because of this fire, which consumed many of the 700 or so objects that were part of the Egyptian collection, along with the other holdings of the museum, which included prehistoric and ethnographic collections, as well as objects from elsewhere in the ancient Americas and Mediterranean. The Egyptian collection of the museum had included several coffins and mummies, stelae, amulets, and figurines, among others, and it was the biggest collection in South America. I choose to start talking about Egyptology in Brazil today with this image for a couple of reasons. First, because unfortunately, it is many foreign people's gateway into the field in the country. Second, and more importantly, because the fire and how the museum dealt with its ramifications and continues to deal with them until today represents, I think, the resilience and creativity present in the study of Egypt in Brazil, despite a lack of support and infrastructure that is a reality for most, if not all, scholars in the country. The museum's approach to the collection post-fire brings up several questions about not only museum practices, but also the study of civilizations like Egypt in countries such as Brazil. But I will get to those in a bit. First, I would like to go back in time to the 1800s, to when Brazil was still an empire, to discuss the inception of the field as well as the National Museum's Egyptian collection in the country. The first important moment that should be mentioned is the arrival of a considerable number of the objects that would make up what would later become the Egyptian collection of the National Museum in 1824. They were taken to Brazil by Nicolau Fiengo, an Italian merchant, after being excavated, if we choose to use that word, by Giovanni Belzoni in Egypt. And they were bought by Dom Pedro I, the first emperor of Brazil, after it ceased to be a Portuguese colony. More of the collection was later amassed by Dom Pedro II, the second and last monarch of the Empire of Brazil. He is still today considered by some the father of Egyptology in the country. Indeed, he was a great supporter of the arts and sciences and had a deep love of learning. His fascination with Egypt led him to acquire objects when he visited the country. And here you can see a photograph of one of those visits on the right. And the emperor corresponded with Mariette actually on many occasions, and you can also see him in the photograph. These objects made up part of the Egyptian collection of what would later become the National Museum. One of the highlights of the collection, given as a gift by the Khedive Ismail Pasha of Egypt to Dom Pedro II in 1876, was the coffin of Shah Mun-Emsu, a priestess from Thebes in the 22nd dynasty. Dom Pedro II found it so beautiful that he kept it in his office until his death. Shah Mun-Emsu's coffin was one of the objects that burned in 2018, unfortunately. It had been kept sealed until then, though researchers had used scanning techniques to see inside the coffin without harming it or disturbing the priestess. Both Dom Pedro II's travel diaries, in which he wrote about many of his travels, not only Egypt, and certain newspapers of the period, including some of the ones shown here, the Diário do Maranhão and the Diário do Rio de Janeiro, discuss both current events in Egypt and archaeological discoveries of the time, the latter at least in part prompted by Dom Pedro II's own interest in the region. The emperor's diaries in particular are written not from the perspective of a monarch, but that of a traveler. He wrote of his impressions of the contemporary local people and their heritage not from a place of superiority, but one of curiosity and appreciation. A recent study conducted on the language and content present in those records demonstrates that when news came from Europe, Egypt was seen through a Eurocentric lens that considered it, alongside Brazil itself, of course, as backwards and primitive. When written from the perspective of Brazilian travelers to Egypt themselves, however, accounts were much more sympathetic and willing to acknowledge Egyptian accomplishments and innovations, rather than assuming they all came from Europe. And the Suez Canal is one example of this. Such views were later influenced by Eurocentric Orientalism, and it is important to highlight that at least early on, Brazilian Egyptology was conducted from that perspective, using European approaches. But I think it important to highlight also that Brazilian approaches to Egypt themselves were from the beginning largely separate from and less hierarchical than European ones. The first serious academic engagement with the collection after that of Dom Pedro II occurred in the early 1900s. Alberto Child, a Russian Egyptologist, who is here shown leftmost on the bottom row, and here you can see that he's pictured with Albert Einstein in one of his visits to the National Museum. He was the author of the first catalog of the collection published in 1919. This catalog was later updated and improved by Kenneth Kitchen, the well-known British Egyptologist, in 1985 after he visited the collection a handful of times. Kitchen's catalog remains the most complete account of the collection, despite some issues with accuracy and object descriptions. Besides Alberto Child, significant names in Brazilian Egyptology have since included the likes of Emanuel Araújo, who taught and researched at the University of Brasilia and published a book with the first widely available Portuguese translations of a series of Egyptian literary texts. Ciro Cardoso, a historian with wide interests ranging from historiographical methodology to the ancient world, and more specifically Egypt, and Antonio Brancalhão, who curated the Egyptian collection of the National Museum for several years. Ciro Cardoso, in particular, is a fantastic example of a Brazilian scholar who managed to approach ancient Egypt with ideas different from those most common in mainstream scholarship due to his education and background as a Brazilian academic. He wrote about the economy of ancient Egypt through a Marxist lens, using social theory developed both in Brazil and outside of it to study Egypt. Most of his work on ancient Egypt was not published while he was still alive, and our colleague Renan Lemos, among others, is now working to publish those studies. Around the time that Kitchen was publishing the catalog of the Egyptian collection of the National Museum, so around 1985, it became possible to be formally trained as an Egyptologist in Brazil. This first center of Egyptological study was founded in the Federal University in Rio de Janeiro, but now there are opportunities for formal study in several different areas of Brazil, some of which you can see on the map here, on which I've marked not only academic departments, but also museums with Egyptian objects. It is a clear fact, however, that funding and infrastructure are still much lower than would be ideal. Support for the humanities in Brazil in general is embarrassingly low, something we are of course also familiar with in the US, but on a much smaller scale. And that for the study of the ancient world, including Egypt, is no different. This lack of support, of course, is one of the reasons why Egyptology in Brazil is often considered inferior to that conducted in the supposed centers, including Europe and North America. The fact that Brazilian Egyptologists usually have to find ways to go abroad to attain a level of training comparable to their international peers is extremely problematic, since many cannot afford to do so. If one stays in Brazil, one does not always have the opportunity to learn all phases of the ancient language or to become proficient enough in one of the main modern Egyptological languages, so English, French, or German, to be able to publish in it, which also makes one's scholarship in Portuguese sadly mostly irrelevant on the international stage. Writing in 2014, our colleague Renan Lemos compared Brazilian Egyptology to the Karnak temple, in the sense that, like Karnak, Brazilian Egyptology was built upon a strong foundation, founded and supported by scholars such as Araújo and Cardoso, but was by no means finished. Like the temple that was constantly added to by generations upon generations of Egyptian kings, Brazilian Egyptology would need to continue growing in order to remain, or become really, relevant and influential. This growth needed to be done in a collaborative manner. Much of this remains true today, and our collective project, which Inesh will speak about more directly in a couple of minutes, seeks to harness that collaborative approach once again. This cooperation, of course, cannot be restricted to collaborations between Brazilian Egyptologists themselves, but it also needs to include collaborations with the Egyptologists outside of Brazil, from both centers and other so-called peripheries, and with the general public. The three of us are ourselves involved in frequent outreach with non-academic audiences through a podcast, and Brazilian Egyptological research centers are commonplace on Instagram and YouTube, where they conduct remote courses and share up-to-date information about ancient Egypt with the interested general public in Portuguese. To end this section on Brazil specifically, I would like to briefly return to the National Museum fire. But in fact, what I wish to talk about now is no longer the fire itself, but rather what has taken place after the fire. The day after it happened, on September 3rd, 2018, researchers of the National Museum were already gathering outside the building to plan their rescue of the collection. Many of them were archaeologists, and so the answer was obvious. They would excavate, and by doing so, recover what was recoverable by preserving its context and thus reconstructing the museum room by room. Here you see an image of the excavation work in the room where the Egyptian collection was found, as well as two shabtis that underwent a color change in the fire. They had originally been green. While the damage and loss are of course irreparable, a lot of the museum's collections, including Egyptian objects, have been recovered. The Egyptian objects in particular are now being considered in new and distinct ways through scientific analyses and three-dimensional modeling. Rather than erasing the destruction, researchers at the museum are considering it a vital part of these objects' histories and using it to think about Egyptian objects not only in their ancient, but also in their modern contexts. Rather than erasure, the goal here is to rebuild, something that aligns with decolonial movements and scholarship that seek to promote healing, including through cooperation with local communities. When the fire occurred, Zahi Hawass used it as an example of why foreign countries housing Egyptian objects should return them to Egypt. If you cannot take care of them, return them, to paraphrase. Of course, he had the right to say so. But immediate reactions to the fire, such as Hawass's or the shock and dismay that reverberated worldwide, both in academic and non-academic communities, are often what remain most present in people's memories, rather than the innovative and creative ways in which Brazilian researchers dealt with the consequences, and how they are now thinking of new ways to engage with the objects. My use of the fire as a metaphor for Brazilian Egyptology may be in poor taste. I haven't really decided. It is at least certainly less optimistic than Hanun's comparison with the Temple of Karnak, which I mentioned a few minutes ago. But I think it is fitting. It stands for the struggle for appropriate infrastructure and thus a perceived inferiority in the field in Brazil, which is itself also intertwined with our own colonial past and the legacies of Eurocentrism in the country. It also, I hope, makes it clear that with collaboration and creative thinking, Brazilian Egyptology has the potential to really flourish. And in doing so, hopefully to add to mainstream Egyptology, thus helping our field to move forward and heal as well. Our major contribution to help Lusophone Egyptologists move forward is currently our editorial project, a collaborative effort between dozens of Portuguese-speaking scholars, which aims to create a foundation for the future. But I will let Ines introduce our project to you. Ines, you're muted, my dear.
Sorry, classic Zoom accident. Thank you, Louise and Guilherme. So the main goal of our editorial project is to emphasize the original thematic, theoretical, and methodological heterogeneity that characterizes Egyptological research produced in Brazil and in Portugal. Although our authors originate from these two countries, many of them work abroad in the US, Germany, England, France, Egypt, Sudan, and so forth. Part of our goal was to place Portuguese-speaking academics working in different contexts and countries in dialogue, perhaps leading to collaborations that might not have taken place due to the siloed nature of our field. Our authors also come from different backgrounds, so we included people who are still completing their studies, people holding academic positions in universities, people working in museums, independent researchers, and Egyptologists who now work in other industries. By inviting Lusophone Egyptologists of different backgrounds to contribute to this vital discussion of past and current research, we hope to help the field move towards a more collaborative Egyptology. As such, this project is theoretically and epistemologically grounded in the current post-colonial discourse of the humanities and in recent debates on global history and on cooperation in academia at an international level. As mentioned, this publication will bring together several speaking Portuguese researchers who study ancient Egypt and Nubia. Their research deals with various topics and originate from different theoretical methodological approaches. Besides emphasizing the diversity that characterizes Egyptologies produced in Brazil and Portugal, this project seeks to contribute to the consolidation of studies on the civilizations of Egypt and Nubia in Lusophone countries. So this part of our presentation seeks to give you an idea of the breadth of chapters. We have translated the section and article titles to English for the purpose of this presentation, but we've made it a point that the book itself will all be written in Portuguese. There will be abstracts for every chapter in English to ensure that non-Portuguese speakers are able to identify topics of interest, and so that the book can be placed into international Egyptological context. But by keeping the chapters themselves in Portuguese, we hope to make a statement to the effect that language hierarchies should have no place in scholarship. This type of hierarchization of scholarship written in different languages has long been a reality in the field of Egyptology, and most of its negative ramifications have so far been pointed out only in terms of Arabic, the Arabic language. The lack of visibility of scholarship written in Arabic is particularly problematic, given that it's the native language of the country whose ancient culture we study, but it is a problem for other languages as well, including Portuguese. So the first part of the book seeks to introduce Lusophone Egyptologies, their authors, and main works. These chapters will include overviews of the development of scholarship in these countries, as well as an expansive bibliography that will make that scholarship more visible. The second part of the book seeks to contextualize Lusophone Egyptological production in a global context. The third part focuses on the reception of ancient Egypt in Brazil and Portugal. The fourth part includes chapters on different theoretical and methodological perspectives. Since part of our goal with this book is for it to serve as a sort of handbook for the study of ancient Egypt in Portuguese-speaking countries, these chapters will consist of a state-of-the-art overview of particular methodological and theoretical topics. That they are written by scholars of a Lusophone background means that they will often offer perspectives that will add to practices common to Egyptology conducted in other countries. So these chapters will include discussions of archaeology, materiality, architecture, Egyptian art, texts and philology, including the significance of Arabic sources for Egyptology, a rarely discussed topic, translations, geoarchaeology, bioarchaeology, and theories such as post-colonial and decolonization theory, history from below and from above, and gender. we have sought to be as comprehensive as possible, at the same time prioritizing topics of expertise to scholars in Lusophone contexts. The fifth part of the book includes chapters on Brazilian and Portuguese excavations in Egypt, an area of profound innovation in the field. José Roberto Bellini, the author of the chapter on Brazilian excavations, for example, developed original work on sensory archaeology and has produced interesting results from his excavation project in Luxor, published in international journals and books. Such perspectives are very new in Egyptology, not just in the Lusophone context, and by highlighting them here, we seek to emphasize the importance of these studies to Egyptology as a whole. The sixth and last part of the book covers the history of development of Egyptian collections in Brazil and Portugal. We have included chapters that will discuss the origins of such collections, and additionally, this section gathers brief descriptions of all the collections of Egyptian objects in Brazil and Portugal, many of which are extensive and include important objects that are not always published. It will thus be able to be used as a preliminary catalog for research, again, not just in Lusophone contexts, but also outside of them. This section of the book also includes reflections on museums and education, as well as on different technologies and how they can be used to increase our knowledge of the past. It emphasizes the need for academics to communicate with the general public about their research, something especially relevant with the diminishing institutional interest in and funding for the humanities internationally. With this book, we hope to provide a useful and informative panorama of Egyptologies in Portuguese-speaking countries and by Portuguese-speaking scholars, thus further consolidating the discipline in these contexts and contributing to the international discussion on how Egyptology should move forward in the years to come. So essentially, to think about Lusophone Egyptologies is to reflect on the place and action of Egyptology on a global scale. This project aims at true diversity in which criteria for exclusion and inclusion are not ignored, but rather in which they are acknowledged in all their complexity. The aim is to make known the work producing these spaces, usually neglected by traditional centers of Egyptological production in the North Atlantic. Despite being located in a supposed Egyptological periphery, the works of these researchers include archaeological excavations, work in museum collections, Egyptian language and grammar, and perceptions about from ancient Egypt in contemporary Brazilian and Portuguese societies, among many others. So the idea here is to deconstruct this ideology, questioning the relationship between center and periphery. Can we really speak of periphery when research produced in Lusophone contexts is comparable to that produced in the centers? And how exactly does one conceptualize center and or periphery? Which criteria are put forward to establish such a distinction, and who defined them in the first place? Alongside the center-periphery dichotomy, focusing on Portuguese-speaking Egyptologies might also be productive in challenging another conceptual binary, the colonizer-colonized. Portugal is a former colonial power, and Brazil, a former colonized territory, was invaded by the former. So despite having both the historical and geographical criteria that have traditionally facilitated the rise of a given country to the core of the discipline, meaning a colonial past and a geographical location on the global north, Portugal has not taken a leading position in what Egyptological production is concerned, and Guilherme already touched upon some of the reasons for this. Likewise, Brazil's position as a former colonized territory in the global south cannot be presented as an all-encompassing criterion to address the complex realities of Brazilian Egyptologies. Therefore, Lusophone Egyptologies offer a fruitful reminder that while the North and the South are historically and geographically different, there are also significant inner discrepancies within these geographical and ideological realities. Notwithstanding the historical contingencies and impact in knowledge production and epistemology stemming from the binomial colonizer-colonized, the trajectories of Portuguese-speaking Egyptologies indicate that such a binary does not suffice to fully address the multifolded and hyphenated realities of Egyptology as a whole. As Guilherme mentioned earlier, Egyptology is by no means a homogeneous or historically linear discipline. On the contrary, this field of knowledge has developed along intricate and diverse paths, exhibiting significant variations, both synchronically and diachronically. The heterogeneity of Egyptological perspectives and practices that have emerged in different latitudes might act in favor of a conceptual pluralization. Rather than referring to Egyptology, the term Egyptologies should be put forward to accurately touch upon such complex realities. In fact, despite being a field of global engagement, different national or local approaches regarding Egyptology have been adopted in diverse shapes and forms, rooted in local particularities, including national and regional histories, geopolitics, and economics, among other factors, consequently impacting epistemological accessibility as well as knowledge production and consumption. Unsurprisingly, the histories of what might be envisaged as the long-standing Egyptological powers tend to dominate the discipline's historiographical discussions. Thus, whereas some of these national or local narratives are better known by the community of Egyptologists, others have remained largely absent from Egyptology's past and present debates. It is safe to say that Portuguese-speaking Egyptologies belong to the group of those narratives which have been absent, ignored, and neglected from the mainstream Egyptological discourse. Since the field of Egyptology is becoming more self-reflexive than ever before, it is fundamental to advocate for a more diverse and inclusive field, both in speech and in practice. This diversity concerns not only theories and methodologies, but also languages and identities. Therefore, our project intends to inscribe Portuguese-speaking Egyptologies in the current discussions on the discipline. However, it is important to note that we are not conducting an identitarian quest on the essence of Portuguese-speaking Egyptology, since that would inevitably offer a reductionist view of our reality. Rather, our main purpose is to present a panorama of the different paths followed in Portugal and Brazil regarding ancient Egyptian studies, and more importantly, to emphasize that Lusophone Egyptologists make their own very relevant contributions that serve not only Lusophone academic contexts, but also global Egyptology as a whole. Inasmuch as Portuguese-speaking Egyptologies partake in Egyptology, they have to be accounted for and acknowledged when surveying and reflecting on the broader reality of the field. Thank you so much for everyone's attention. We would appreciate any comments, suggestions, and we leave our email addresses in here if you want to get in touch with us. Thank you.
Thank you. That was awesome. I don't know how else to say it. We have Q&A open. If anybody has questions, just go ahead and type them in there and I can moderate them. I have a question to kind of start off. So two, really. One is more of a comment. The images that you all shared were brand new to my eyes, which they're amazing. They were beautiful and just these amazing perspectives that you don't normally see. So thank you so much for sharing them. Dom Pedro II, I know in 1871, he did like a tour of Europe also. So he was in London for a while. I know he went to some like lectures at South Kensington, physics and chemistry and all of that kind of stuff. So I'm assuming that his trip to Egypt was kind of part of that grand tour. So did he seemed to be really into science in general and bringing it back to Brazil for educational purposes. Can you talk a little bit more about that, especially in the context of Egypt?
Sure, yeah. So he definitely, you said 1871. Yeah, that was one visit. And then the image I showed, I think, was from 1876. So that was the second time he went to Egypt. And that's when, I think that's when he got most of the collection, but I could be wrong about that. Well, no, I think that the second time was when he got that coffin I showed, at least. But I think he got stuff in both times. But yes, he was very interested in the humanities and social sciences more generally. And he was actually very critiqued in Brazil for being more of, I forget the phrase that was used, but more of a scholar than an emperor. So he got a lot of flack for that at home. But I think he did have a lot of relationships with academics outside of Brazil, and he was seen by those people and not by the Brazilians themselves as a very well-educated, very important figure in the humanities more broadly in that period. So yeah, I mean, the collection at the National Museum of Brazil isn't by no means the only important collection in Brazil, and is not really the only starting point for speaking about Egyptology there, but I started with that because of the fire, but also because I think of Dom Pedro II's role in kind of bringing Egypt to the country, if that kind of answers your question.
Yeah. That's fascinating. And that image that you started with is sort of it just smacks you right in the face, doesn't it? I mean, you just
Always makes me cry. I'm surprised
yes.
today.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Thank you so much. Okay, I have a question. And I think that I'm going to get the name right. Joanna Popelska Grabowska. She says, congratulations on your informative and important lecture. I would like to add that in the proceedings of 2 events organized by Polish, Italian, Romanian Egyptologists, there will be published 2 chapters by Maria Helena Trinidad Lopez on the history of Egyptology in Portugal. You all know about that one already. And on the history of Portuguese excavations in Egypt. And that she had published a few papers on Polish-Portuguese collaboration within Egyptology. So that's great that she's here for that. And then a question, would you include non-native Portuguese speaking scholars who published papers in Portuguese? Any of you can go with that one.
Inez, would you like to start or should I? Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Popieska-Żybowska, for your presence here. And obviously the collaboration between Portugal and Poland and what Egyptology is concerned is not forgotten by us. It's just that I didn't have much time to address all the issues. And I tried to pack literally 500 years of history in a 20 minutes talk, so to say. So that was very difficult to compile everything, but obviously it's not forgotten. I was aware that Professor Trinidad Lopes presented a lecture on Portuguese Egyptology last year at the online event in Trieste. Well, online, but supposedly to be held in Trieste. But I wasn't aware that she was going to publish that in the proceedings. So I'm very looking forward, as I'm sure we all are, to read that paper, and I'm sure it will be quite informative for our project. As for the non-native speakers publishing in Portuguese, we do appreciate their work so much, and it's such an endeavor that we're so, I think I can speak for all of us, we're so not used to it that I think we still have to sort of reconceptualize and think how to address it properly in our book. But for sure it must be featured because it's a very important thing. And by the way, I must say thank you, Professor Popieska-Żybowska, for continuing to publish in Portuguese, which is a wonderful thing for us that, again, we're not accustomed to. We're definitely more used to having to learn English, French, and German to be published, rather than people from foreign languages published in Portuguese. So again, thank you very much for your presence and comments. I don't know if you want to add something, Ines.
No, that's basically it. I was aware that Professor Maria Elena was going to publish something soon, okay. But because it's not out yet, we did not include it in our, recently published studies. But it's definitely something that we're looking forward to. And yeah, definitely your contributions to Portuguese-speaking Egyptology have not been forgotten and are very much appreciated. It's what Guilherme was saying. It's so rare for someone to speak Portuguese, and when they're not, Portuguese speakers or native Portuguese speakers, that it's just, I feel flattered all the time. People are interested.
Excellent. She said that she sent a smiley face. That's great. Oh, she said the first will be published before June 2023. Other questions coming in, go ahead and put them in there. While people are doing that, Stacy, do you have a question?
Yes, I could not find a way to type anything in the Q&A since I'm technically part of the panel. So I'll just say it out loud. So first of all, thank you all for that presentation. I echo what Kate said, and that, even though we study Egyptology and we study the history of Egyptology, almost all of that information was completely new to me because that was not ever part of my training, and I did not have any way to access that information. So I think that this is a really crucial presentation that you have provided us today, and wish you all success with this. My question may be a hard one and anyone can answer, but you mentioned, each of you mentioned several times about the difference in approaches between Portuguese and Brazilian Egyptology and, let's say, traditional Egyptology, or the way it's traditionally been done or taught. Can you each select one of those themes or one of those areas or issues where you think Egyptology can be improved by using some approach or some technique or some idea from either Brazil or Portugal, and share that with us.
I guess I'll go first since I haven't spoken yet, but I would say, like, very generally, and very generally speaking, I see a lack of engagement with other disciplines and theory coming from other disciplines in Egyptology that is, like, striking. And I see a fear as well of interpreting things. Oh, but we can't know. There's no way we can know this. So why are you using this theory? Or why are you trying to guess how people felt or what they did? It's very much, we publish the data. We publish the data. We're very analytical. This is in mainstream Egyptology, I mean. And I felt that as well throughout my, studies, my master's, my PhD. There's very much that idea of, we publish data. Interpretation is less of a thing. And that doesn't happen so much in, as I mentioned, in Brazilian and Portuguese Egyptology, because we don't really have data to publish, and we don't really have access to data for, to publish data. So we tend to engage with other disciplines, history, social sciences, other disciplines in the humanities, anthropology, actual archaeological theory, not just, excavating a hole, but actually, engaging in the broader archaeological discourse. That happens much more within our, countries' work, Egyptological work, then I see. I studied in England and I studied in the US. And so I'm speaking from the perspective of these countries. I'm not speaking about Germany or France. I can't, because I haven't studied there. But I know that, for example, Guy studied in France as well for a while, so he perhaps can inform us on that regard. But I see a bigger, stronger engagement with theoretical approaches that are trying to understand not just, that the things are there, but why are they there? Without, obviously, we cannot speak to intentionality. We can never guess what people actually did or, what they thought. Obviously, that's obvious. But we can try to give suggestions. And that's all really we can do, because we can't know anything anyway, because the register is incomplete. And we can try as much as we can, but we're always going to have only like one side, like only a part of the information. So in general, as I mentioned, what we can offer is to show that there is very fruitful engagement with other disciplines and in asking questions on the why, not as much like how it was built, but why it was built, or, and I think that in that regard, we can offer some interesting perspectives. But I'll let Guy and Louisa, if they want to say something and add to this. I don't know if you're thinking about specific examples. I can't, for, on the top of my head, just think about specific works, but.
If I might just add something on that, to echo what Inez was saying, also regarding training. I mean, this is obviously due to unfortunate circumstances, and by this I mean the lack of investment in Egyptology in Portugal and in Brazil as well. But I obviously speak mostly for the Portuguese case, since I'm Portuguese myself. So as I was saying, obviously this is due to unfortunate political and economical circumstances, but I think Egyptology worldwide, in terms of training, can really profit from having subjects on non-Egyptological topics, so to say. So if I take my example as a sort of a brief case study here, I studied history and I covered from prehistory to 20th century history. And then I moved on to the master's and to the PhD. And this was all combined with seminars and courses on other historical periods, methodologies and theories, which have improved, I hope they have, at least they helped me shaping my perception of Egypt and ancient Egypt in the topics I address and study in my research in a sort of a broader and more contextualized way. And I think that has helped me a lot. And obviously, I mean, don't get me wrong, we do need more investment in Egyptology in Portugal. We need more courses on language, on specific topics, on analysis of materials, perhaps even having visits and tours to Egyptian collections and Egypt itself, of course. We need more archaeological training in Egypt, not just other archaeological sites. But I think we have this sort of, dare I say, a cultural and intellectual capital, so to say, that we can revert to our Egyptological studies. And I think that's, I don't want to call it a lesson, because I don't want to sound condescending or patronizing, but I think that's something that other countries might be inspired by, this idea of getting sort of a more interdisciplinary and cross cross-historical training. I think that's very interesting. Yeah.
And since you got two Portuguese perspectives, I'll just add a little bit from Brazil. I'll be candid in saying that my entire Egyptological formation has been in the US. So I often actually struggle to have this platform and to speak of Brazilian Egyptology when I'm Brazilian, but I myself have not really been a part of that academic milieu before getting involved in this project. So this has been a huge learning experience for me in terms of methods learned in the country. And Renan Lemos did a lot more of his formation in Brazil than I did, so he is more familiar. But two examples that come to mind immediately. One is Ciro Cardoso, who I mentioned during the lecture. And as I said, a lot of his work hasn't actually been published yet, but he used social theory very thoroughly when he was writing. Before that volume on a social history, for instance, was published, the really famous volume. And of course, social theory is now more used in Egyptology, but I think we could say that he was a proponent of such methods in the field. And unfortunately, his work is not known. And then something else that Ines also already mentioned, Roberto Pellini, who has an excavation in Egypt, has really been drawing from sensory archaeology, which is, again, not really popular in Egyptology for reasons that I can certainly understand. But I just wrote a chapter for a Festschrift on kind of sensory approaches to royal rituals. And I really struggled to find phenomenological treatments in Egyptology itself. And I had to draw a lot from outside. So I think that's another example of someone who's really bringing innovations into the field and who has fortunately published in international journals, but I think his work is still not as well known as it should be. So.
Wow, thank you all for your answers. I mean, I think there's a lot that that we can agree with. Certainly from my own perspective, I do a lot of interdisciplinary work, which is sometimes seen as, well, is that really Egyptology then? Because you're doing history, you're doing arts. I mean, does this have a place here? And I like that we're all on the same page and we think that, yes, this actually is a very, very legitimate place in understanding about ancient Egypt and how we teach Egypt to other people today. And I often also look to other disciplines and their literature to see kind of what is useful and what can be applied to the study of ancient Egypt as well. So I'm really glad that you each provided such amazing answers for that question, because I'm also, as an educator, I'm someone who likes to try to find the tools then. So we've identified the problem, but then how do we go about trying to correct or help out the situation? So I'm always looking for really amazing suggestions like that of just kind of keep doing these things, and just, it's okay to innovate. It's okay to try something new, and we don't always have to do the way it has been taught before or study the way it has been done before. So thank you all for those answers.
No, absolutely, Stacey. And in fact, I think that there is now a trend. I see many more people now just leaving that traditional, Egyptological approach to things, which, in a way, from my experience, when I say that I'm an Egyptologist to people that are archaeologists that working in different periods, different areas, or, historians, no one really takes Egyptology seriously outside of Egyptology. And that's partly because we don't really engage with other disciplines, or we haven't traditionally. And that's changing. And I'm seeing more and more of this, like all of us in here present in this, talk. And it gives me hope, because it's not just, a couple of people trying to swim against the, it's more and more of us. And as you as an educator, as we also as educators, as we go out there and we start teaching ancient Egypt, and we tell people that there's different ways of doing Egyptology, and they're all Egyptology, and it's all fine, because Egyptology is the study of ancient Egypt. So if you study ancient Egypt, guess what? You're an Egyptologist. So, you don't need to learn to know the language if you're not studying language, but you do need to have good translations to rely on, right? And this is, for example, one area in which Portugal, it's hard if you don't know the language, you don't have good translations. Like, how do you manage that? But yeah, I mean, I see I'm hopeful. I'm an optimistic person. I see, you know, I think that the future is bright. And I think that we are more and more, you know, as I said, self-reflective. Egyptology is thinking more about these issues. And you, ARCE-MO, gave us this platform to talk about these issues, which perhaps would not have happened, I don't know, 10 years ago, right? So, you know, this is, it's great. And thank you for allowing us to be here and sharing our project and our perspectives.
Oh, you are so welcome. This has been so fascinating. And even though I do not know Portuguese, I'm going to look for what you guys do. And hopefully I will be able to understand and process some of it.
May I just say one last thing, if I may? Also, just to echo what Inez was saying, and I totally second that. Also, when we're doing, so to say, traditional Egyptology, so let's say a translation of a text, the fact that we come from another native language than the mainstream ones already allows us to address an ancient text in a different way, because necessarily conceptualize language in a different shape and form. So when we're translating, even to English, French, or German, the fact that we start from the Portuguese, I think it's also quite informative on how we approach translations and how we envisage a language. And I'm telling this because basically for my PhD thesis, I'm translating a Egyptian text corpus. So I've often, to Portuguese, I'm saying. So I've often found this issue of approaching translation in a different perspective as well, because obviously language construction and conceptualization differs from different idioms. So it's really interesting to also, when we're doing this, so to say, traditional Egyptology, I think it's also a difference that we may bring to the field. Yeah, just wanted to say that. Yeah, thank you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Great. I don't see any more questions. Kate, do you see any more questions? Okay, no. Would you like to put up that last slide, please? All right, so thank you all again to each of the speakers for an absolutely amazing, thought-provoking, fascinating presentation. I know that we're all looking forward to seeing more about the project and what you're able to do. I'll just end up today with saying that ARCE-MO is working on our Spring 2023 program, and we have 2 of our events that we'd like to highlight for you today. So in January of 2023, we're going to have the first in a professionalization series. So the idea behind this series is to have a sort of a workshop type of situation for some of those skills that we would like to have in our studies or our jobs that we don't necessarily get training in. So this may have to do with articles or editing or just kind of how to present for a conference, things like that. So our first in our series is going to be given by Dr. Brian Brinkman, and he's going to be telling us about indexing. That's definitely something that we're not really taught how to do. So if you're thinking about writing a book, at some point you will need to index that book, and where do you even start with that? So we're looking forward to that presentation. And then in February, we will have another series debut, and that is our first book chat. We will have Dr. William Carruthers, who will be presenting about his brand new book, just out, called Flooded Pasts, UNESCO, Nubia, and the Recolonization of Archaeology. So another history of archaeology, history of Egyptology situation. This is a hot book, so we're looking very much forward to having a conversation with Dr. Carruthers about it. And there will be a few more events that will be announced after the holidays. So thank you all very much for coming. We hope you enjoyed today, as I certainly did. And we hope to see you sometime in the new year. Everyone have safe and happy holidays. We'll see you in the next year.
Thank you.
See you. Thank you. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Thank